Indeed, I'm told there's even a couple of those we're saying good evening to joining us from Asia. And then also, I think is it morning or is just pipped over into afternoon, saying good afternoon to those joining us from North America, be that Canada or the US. I'm Maurice Evelyn Buffton. I am the CEO of Armstrong Wolf. This is the last but one webinar in a series of 20 webinars over the last 3 days in our annual, indeed our first Conduct and Culture Summit 221 Purpose Over Profit. This particular session, which was mirrored by an early morning session this morning, is at the center and really the efforts of Armstrong Wolf and the COO and CCO community over the last 6 to 7 years. In the quarterly forums that many have attended and supported over those 4 to 5 years, I cannot think of one single forum, doesn't matter what the subject's been, when the question of the 3 lines of defense has actually come up for debate. And then particularly when we've had the control officers from the first community around the table, or indeed the COOs, it has quickly galloped towards the inherent challenges between the first and second line. In Q4 last year, in response to this ongoing dialogue, we partnered with FTI, and indeed I've known Mark for many, many years, and actually he used to attend the forums, to actually seek to help address this issue. And what we've done in this context, we are halfway through a 30 bank-wide review of the 3 lines of defense, and this is the interim review of that effort. We as a team, be it FTI and Armstrong Wolf, are committed to supporting the global CRO and CTO community and the industry as a whole in seeking to navigate the industry into a way that it will be able to address some of those inherent challenges. Before handing over to Larry, who's been leading the US effort and partnering Mark from FTI, I'm just going to go around the virtual table to let the introductions. Nigel, sir.
Thank you. My name is Nigel Ward. I'm a partner at FTI in London, where I'm responsible for the firm's EMEA financial services practice. My career has been spent probably 50-50 between the banking sector and consulting. I was a partner at Deloitte and Anderson many years ago, but I also for many years led the alternative investments business at JP Morgan in EMEA.
Thank you, Nigel. Shelley.
Hi, Shelley Leposki. I'm the head of business risk and solutions for capital markets globally at Bank of Montreal.
Mark.
Sure. My name is Mark Warby. I'm a senior managing director with FTI in the financial services practice, where I lead our risk management practice for the Americas. Similar to Nigel, my career has been split probably 50-50 between the banking industry and professional services. Most recently, I was the chief operating officer for the risk management organization for Deutsche Bank in the Americas, where I led the growth and transformation of the risk organization for the establishment of our IHT to meet the enhanced prudential standards. Prior to that, I was a partner at KPMG, working on various engagements in the GRC space.
Thank you, Mark. Xuan.
Hello, Chuan Wong. I'm the Chief Control Officer for Markets and Exchange Services at Bank of New York Mellon.
Thank you very much. Larry, and I'll also at the same time pass the baton for you to take things forward. Larry.
Thank you, Morris. Very happy to be here. Welcome to our session on 3 lines of defense and a view from the first line. You know, being associated with Armstrong Wolf and knowing, you know, attending the different sessions over the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years. I don't think there's a session that goes by from a COO or a chief control officer perspective that a discussion around the 3 lines of defense and the challenges of operationalizing it doesn't come up. It doesn't matter what topic we're talking about, whether it's regulatory, controls, audit, business development. It seems like the 3 lines of defense conundrum is a challenge that everybody faces. And through, you know, all of these discussions, what we decided to do is try to actually do something about it. And that's where the journey started. So in response to the community, we wanted to commission a project to actually develop a deeper understanding of the specifics around the model challenges of the 3 lines of defense. Understand that, you know, with our DNA from a first line perspective, and then create solutions and standards that can be adopted that can create a more common understanding of how to operate and what the regulators and senior management expect of the three lines of defense. I think what's also been challenging about this, about the operationalization of the three lines of defense over the last 5 years, let's say 5 to 6 years, has been that the businesses have undergone tremendously different cycles. So the dynamic environment makes the implementation even more difficult, whether you're an organization going through a regulatory corrective actions, whether you're a business that is shrinking and having to reduce costs, whether you're a business that is growing exponentially and wanting to establish new processes and products. The three lines of defense and the challenges apply. And so our colleagues across the industry are also having to be nimble and adapt, not only to make the three lines of defense work, but also to make it work across all these business cycles, which has been incredibly challenging. And so with that, we wanted to partner with FTI as well, because what FTI brings is a unique perspective around regulatory challenges and what the C-suite brings, has to bring to the table, as well as a deep regulatory understanding. And importantly, experts from the second line of defense to help create standards that we can all base future plans off of. The next steps in the project will be that we will create a document, a white paper, if you will, an opinion paper. In the first instance, it's going to be presented to the FCA for socialization and feedback. And then that process will continue over the coming months. We're very grateful also for all of our colleagues around the market who have participated in this. It's been a large devotion of time, which everybody seems to be quite short of. And so we deeply appreciate those partnerships and the working with FTI to drive to where we are today. So with that, I think I'll step aside and turn it over to Mark, who will provide some feedback on the key themes that our research has uncovered or reinforced, and the way we're thinking about those themes.
Sure, happy to, Larry. So if maybe we could just tap through the deck to the slide on the key themes, if we could. Next one, I believe. Thank you. So thank you, Larry. And what you can see here is, as Larry mentioned, a summary of the output and the feedback that we've received through the various stages, through the discussions with the individual participants, along with the workshops that we performed. While there were certainly variations by firm in terms of the extent to which these issues may apply, there was certainly a common set of foundational challenges and pain points that resonated through the discussion. You'll see here that we've categorized that feedback into 4 areas. However, these are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, you'll see that they are often interrelated in their nature. So perhaps I'll kind of talk to these. Maybe I'll go around here in anti-clockwise order. First I'll touch on the lack of clarity around roles and responsibilities as a theme. This is one that probably came out of the conversations more prominently, and in some ways is foundational to the other areas that you see here. And this is the belief and perception that there is a lack of prescription in the regulations and guidance to support institutions with understanding having a common understanding as it relates to the mandates for the first and second line, and then the development of the underlying roles and responsibilities. I think there was also a view that in some way too much prescription is not necessarily helpful as well, in terms of there's a need to tailor this to the individual circumstances and firms, but generally the lack of prescription can make it more challenging for firms when setting up these mandates across the lines and establishing these roles and responsibilities, and leaves them to make their own interpretations. And in many cases, those interpretations and decisions often based on adverse regulatory or audit feedback, and not necessarily on proactive guidance. And so, consequently, in many of the firms that we saw that the actual, definition or the prescription around the mandates and roles and responsibilities for the first and second lines in those firms were often not necessarily clearly defined, or therefore commonly transparent or understood within the institutions. And even institutions where it was defined, there was often cases where there was inconsistency in the application or the definition of those mandates and roles and responsibilities, either across business lines or even across geographies. Linked with that, in many cases, even debate and discussion around what constitutes the first line, and this often popped up in areas such as human resources, legal, or even product control. As we maybe continue downwards, that's plays particularly into also the mandate around the second line, and in particular around the definition and interpretation of the need for independence in the second line. In some institutions, what does it mean to be independent? If you're independent, what you cannot do within that definition. In some institutions, that's led to a shift away from an advisory model, which I think is often more valued by the first line of defense, to a focus more on testing and insurance, which often results in extending the proximity of the second line away from the business, and negating the strength of the effective challenge for the first line. This has somewhat been increasingly blurred, with the establishment of the risk and control functions in recent years in the first line, and the mandate for those functions. There's been increasingly blurring between the mandate between those functions and the second line. If we move across to the balance of resources, I think, as many of us will be familiar with, the post the 2008 crisis and subsequent years, there was significant investments and growth in the second line within the risk and compliance functions, and as in more recent years, we've seen the growth again in the first line, the risk and control functions. There's not necessarily been a shift in the balance of resources between the lines, and I think there was a common view that, in terms of the totality of the resources, this was not necessarily across the lines. This was not necessarily a concern, but perhaps the allocation of those resources between those that were take on increasing responsibilities for the performance of risk and control functions in the first line versus the oversight functions that were in the second line. Excuse me. And then that also links into the inefficiencies between the lines of defense and potential for duplication of activities. Somewhat, as I mentioned before, the lack of clarity of roles and responsibilities can be a foundation for that. But there's a view that the rigid application of the three lines of defense has resulted in a more siloed implementation that has reduced effectiveness and efficiencies through the duplication of activities across the line. And there was a perception that this may be driven partly by a lack of trust in the first line itself, but also perceived regulatory expectations around what it means for independent oversight for the second line, and also potentially the need to reperform certain activities within the second line that has resulted in duplications of activities and challenges with efficiencies there. So in summary, those are I would say the primary areas of feedback that came out of the survey. For completeness purposes, I would say the majority of the discussion focused around the first and second line, clear. I think with the third line, I think there's more of a belief that the mandate for the first line in terms of its independent assurance is quite clear. But there were, feedback mentioned about where there could be opportunities to improve that coordination between the lines of defense, including the third line in areas such as testing, for example. So with that, maybe Larry, I'll hand back to you.
Sure, thanks, Mark. What we would like to do is, bring our panelists in now. So we're very grateful to have Shelley from BMO and Schwan from Bank of New York Mellon Markets to participate in our session today. I know that these folks have a deep understanding and a deep view of how to think about the three lines of defense. And so, I mean, I guess I just throw it to both of you just to get the panel going. Is do these sort of challenges resonate with you? Maybe Shelley, have we missed anything that maybe comes to mind that from your experience?
Yeah, I think the one thing that is a common theme across all of these is that across the industry, I think most banks are in a different level of maturity if you look at the bank level. And then if you look at lines of business, whether it's a markets business or a retail business or those are in different levels of maturity. And then you look across risk stripes and you look at compliance and operational risk and AML, and there's different levels of maturity even at that level. And so I think these are the themes, but in order to solve for them, you have to look at the maturity level of the issue you're solving for in order to really get to make progress in these areas. It's so diverse across the industry and even within companies that it really takes that level of granularity to fix and solve for some of these.
Schwan, how about any impressions from your side, initial impressions on the themes? I know you've been deeply involved in the debates as well.
Yeah, I think, and from my perspective, I think that the themes definitely do resonate holistically across the board. I think there's aspects of all of them. I think a lot of it, in terms of solution, comes down to sort of the acknowledgement of, or a common understanding of why we're doing this. There's certainly sort of some independence expectation, but if the intent of this lines of defense construct is to sort of mitigate risk and have layers of protection against exogenous risk coming into an organization, I feel like how the various lines have been constructed across organizations doesn't necessarily optimize that mitigation of risk. I think there's often too much of a emphasis on sort of what's auditable of what the first line is doing, and versus actually providing sort of like an independent layer of risk mitigation. I think for me, it's a balance. It's really, we're trying to refocus it on risk mitigation versus sort of setting up sort of a construct that gives the perception of risk management.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. I know, we started at a very top-down sort of perspective on principles, and but we also know that the solutions are where we live, which is the bottoms up and in the details of really creating and executing on programs. If we look at the themes, there's and particularly with duplication plus inefficiencies and equals that we have to manage resources, right? And so defining resource management and trying to eliminate those potential inefficiencies or duplications is a real challenge. And I know, Shelley, you've done a lot of work on that at BMO. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of insight as to how you approached this very large problem, basically.
Yeah, very large and very common problem. So the way that we approach this is by looking at, to Schwan's point, what is the risk we're mitigating, right? So forget about how we've always done things. Forget about frameworks and policies and guidelines and directives and all of the papers and really think about what is it that we're trying to prevent and manage. So we looked at, for example, across the lines of defense, deduping key controls categorized as key. And we reduced controls categorized by key by like 68%, right? And you might go, well, so what? Well, the so what is there was an industry around managing controls categorized by key. And because we did that in collaboration with our second line compliance partners, we were able to take like 5,000 hours of time out of work. That's 2 heads, right? So we could either reduce those 2 heads, or we could use that capacity that we created to go create other efficiencies. And we did a little bit of each. We reduced 1 head and we used 1 head to create capacity to do other work. We've done that in operational risk as well. If you think about, why do we have to report in a backward looking way on losses and events and KRIs and KPIs? Why? What does that do? Does that make us safer? Well, it doesn't actually. It just confirms what's already happened. So we created a capability to predict and prevent loss. Now we don't have to do as much as the backward looking work because we're really focused on prevention, right? And so if you take those 2 examples and you apply them to every risk stripe, you end up creating a significant amount of capacity. We've taken 45 heads out of my team in the last 2 years, and we're more focused, we're more aligned, and I think we're getting better results.
If I can just follow up, I mean, it sounds so simple and so eloquent, right? To just say, look, we want to, we want simple solutions. And I'm sure the regulatory, I know that the regulatory perspective is consistent with that, right? Just give us something simple that makes sense, that's mitigating risk. How did you bring people to the table to do that, right? I mean, you mentioned your own department, but of course, you need to collaborate to really make that effective. What was, how did you go about that?
So it really is a partnership, and I know it's a word that's really squishy and used very frequently, but we had to work with each of our second line partners and the corporate areas. So take the control rationalization work. We sat down and we said, here's the problem. We have an industry around all this stuff, and it doesn't seem like we're safer. What if we rationalize this? And we got everybody on the same page, myself and our team and the second line team. When you create the win-win and you say, well, here's a common problem, and we say, well, what could be the result if we were to solve this? Well, what if we could save a couple heads? What would we do with that? Well, we could reduce cost and we could redeploy resource. So, and self-fund, what would that mean for both of us? Well, people actually like us when we say we've self-funded something, as opposed to going to them and saying we need $1 million to solve a problem. If you go and you say, I've self-funded over here, so I don't need $1 million, but I need 250,000 over here, you're going to get the 250, right? So creating those scenarios over and over again where there's a win-win, and when you go to the table to ask for more, you will have already proven that you've done everything possible to self-fund. And again, doing that in every situation, it's a good win. The other thing we looked at, it's a win-win, I should say. The other thing we looked at is the ratio of people in the first to second line. This played out in operational risk, where we had split our first and second line operational risk teams. And I looked at the number of people I had compared to the second line. And I said, well, if I have 6 people to manage risk, why do you need 12 to oversee and challenge? Right. And just looking at math and numbers, and they said, oh yeah, you're right, we should come down a little bit. And then I came down a little bit more. And then I said, if I have 3, why do you need 8? And you just keep that dialogue going. And of course, it's never perfect, but you can start moving towards a common goal. And I think it's very helpful to do that.
How do you think about this topic where there's a lot of discussion around what sort of controls you need to sit within the first line which ones can the first line effectively delegate, accountability and ownership for, for other areas of the organization where it's in other first line, or second line functions. Obviously, clearly you were taking a very end-to-end view, of this, of your review. How do you think about the topic? Was there any principles that you applied, or were you very open about where those controls, could sit within the organization?
Well, for us, it is a principled approach, and our view is that it's better to have the fire extinguisher next to the fire than at the neighbor's house. So the higher the risk, the closer the people managing the risk should be to that risk, right? If we are being predictive, then you already have you've got a lot of safety net in place because you're trying to predict and prevent. If you're being really detective and you're letting something potentially happen that could be bad, then you have less of a safety net in place, and you're going to want to probably put more support in that situation. So we really took a risk-based approach, and where our program, I talked about those levels of maturity, where our program is more mature, you can take a different approach than where the program's less mature, and you might want to have more people in both the first and second line. I think those are the two ends of the continuum.
Maybe we can bring Nigel in. Nigel, I know that this morning you were participating in a similar session that we held with some of the European and Asian banks. Just wanted to get your perspective, when we talked about some of these areas of challenge in the defense model. Your thoughts on what you heard this morning from our other participants as to whether they resonated or not.
Absolutely. So I think it won't be a surprise to anybody listening that I think the same themes applied almost irrespective of geography. So anybody sitting in this morning's session, I think, would still be nodding their heads at the same places as they listen to this dialogue unfold. I think the kind of areas that got touched on relevant to the conversation we've just had were, again, a feeling that perhaps whilst there had been some adjustment down in the second line was probably, and we're being generic here, somewhat overstaffed, and the first line somewhat understaffed, or at least that was the view from the first line, predictably. And I think particularly a point that was made very strongly was that the trend over the last few years has been increasingly to think of ownership of risks and therefore the ownership of a lot of the controls to have migrated. And that direction of migration has been pretty much one way towards the first line. So you have this situation at the moment where I think there was a strong sense this morning that there was still a bit of an imbalance, that there'd been a big uptick in terms of the responsibilities that the first line was taking on its shoulders without perhaps the full adjustment having been made in terms of personnel. I think one of the other points, again, that was made earlier related to quite how, in particular, the compliance function was responding to this kind of challenge. And I think one of the, I'll call it a frustration that was expressed this morning, was that frequently the bit that the first line valued most about the second line was what you might call a genuine advisory function within compliance. And frequently organizations had taken it upon themselves to move some of those advisory staff into the first line. And we've seen various terminology used like line 1B or line 1.5. In other words, these are people no longer answering to the beat of the compliance drum, but are providing advisory compliance style guidance to the first line from the benefit of perhaps being much closer to the business that the second line would conventionally be. And whilst everybody was thrilled about this, the concern it left was that if you weren't careful, the second line was left doing testing and checking. And these were kind of functions which were regarded by people as being perhaps less value adding than the advisory functions have now been inherited. So I think if I try and draw it all together on this particular subject, there was a sense of imbalance of resources. There was a sense perhaps that there was an inequality in terms of responsibilities versus the resources that had been allocated. And there was also a sense that the compliance function was perhaps finding its role in the new world, and that probably there needed to be some deep thinking about where the compliance really needed to be rather more than checking assurance and testing, and whether there was something else it should be doing over and above that function.
Thank you, Nigel. It's Larry back here. I'd like to bring Schwan into the debate here, because I think you've just led into a really interesting point, Nigel, which is that movement of advisory resources potentially into the first line is clearly a recognition that the first line, let's say, owns the risks. But I think it's also a reaction to the fact that ultimately the second line of defense model, let's say, is meant to minimize risk. And, so then firms do things in reaction when we're not achieving the goal of, or perceiving achieving the goal of minimizing risk. And I'd like to get Schwan's view on how at BNY, I know you're there trying to create some momentum and change around and focus on risk. Maybe you can give us some insight as to, some of the first, principles that you're working with over there.
Sure. So look, I agree with what Nigel said. I mean, I can certainly appreciate and recognize that same storyline for unfolding across the industry, because I think, to sort of a point that was made earlier, it's about risk. It should be about risk mitigation, not so much about sort of providing assurance and testing. That's not a line of defense. That's just quality assurance, really. Where I think the tendency is a lot of the resources to flow towards that sort of directive, because that's I think that's easier to do and more observable and sort of more evidenceable insofar as so-called challenge per se. Whereas the actual hard bit is stopping an issue before it happens and being at the coalface when something happens, which is why that compensation that the first line has had to make to to resource up to give that proper viewpoint to prevent something from happening. That's why that's happening. Whereas I feel like that's just really an interpretative bias in terms of how these constructs have been set up historically. But in terms of the path forward, I think it does have to start with sort of what Shelley mentioned, where it has to be firstly a common understanding of how much risk you're really running and where you actually run risk itself. Once you can articulate that and measure it and show demonstrable improvement or actually objective measurement of that, not measuring whether or not you complied with a policy, et cetera, but actually, what were the, are you preventing incidents? Are you mitigating sort of regulatory exposure? Are you mitigating your sort of compliance exposure? Are you running sort of excess risk in any of the market, credit, operational disciplines? That's the bit that has to be sort of clearly understood, which then you can then align the controls against it. I think there's this word controls is often thrown out. It is obviously more of a first line responsibility, because it's where you face the market, it's where you face clients. That's where it happens. However, moving up that level of not checking per se, but that level of protection forward, as and when transactions, deals happen, is definitely more beneficial than just focusing on an assurance function. You really, all that is really just duplicating an audit process.
I think you're right. If I may, another perspective from the European session or European and Asian session this morning, which was, we looked a little bit about the kind of non-direct business risks. So risk, for example, relating to financial crime, where responsibility clearly from a regulatory standpoint still lies with the business, but where some of the obvious preventative measures are perhaps more evenly distributed. So, for example, if we talk about the monitoring of trading patterns, for example, one of the controversies that arose in Europe was, on the one hand, the argument that monitoring and surveillance can only be carried out by the first line of defense, because frankly, the second line of defense don't understand the jargon, they don't understand the business closely enough to be able to understand what they're seeing. And then you have the counter argument, which is, well, there's no point in having the traders monitor themselves because that's no kind of a control at all. It can only effectively take place in the second line. And I think similar sorts of observations were made more generally about the kind of external financial crime, whether it was attempts, for example, to use the financial institution for money laundering or similar, the feeling that perhaps whilst there was a tendency to push these controls into the first line, there were substantial elements of it that could only reasonably be carried out on the second line. And this seemed to divide the first line people that we spoke to. Some feeling very comfortable to push this into the second line, others feeling the only place that some of these things could properly get done was within the first line, largely because they cited a lack of confidence that the second line understood the business closely enough to be able to implement the kind of controls that were going to be effective. I don't know whether that again resonates with you.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I appreciate that sort of paradigm. But the way I think about it is, I think independence is very important, and we shouldn't compensate for that because you've got the wrong people reviewing the risk. I mean, maybe the answer is you need to have the qualified people as well to actually do the surveillance. But I think there's a high degree of specialization in those topics that there are people that are very focused to understand financial crime risks over and above, what your typical relationship manager in the front office may appreciate. Understanding of all the various rules and nuances to do with things like sanctions and all the financial crime manifestations that exist in the world. I feel like that is a specialist role, and I don't see an issue if that is sort of done away, as long as you've got the right qualified people doing it. And I think you do still get the benefit of independence. So I'm certainly more in that sort of independent camp, assuming that you've got the right people doing it. And I don't see that as a conflict, and I don't see that as actually being an issue with how lines of defense should be working.
So you make a great point, and it's almost as if we rehearsed this, because this word independence came up directly on the back of that same conversation this morning. And it's a really interesting one, maybe just to put to both of you, which was, so more commonly people could agree that it was important to have a particular function that was independent. But did it have to be in a different line of defense in order to meet that test? And I think there were some who even went so far as to say that the distinction between different lines of defense was increasingly becoming redundant, because providing we could demonstrate and create that independence with the right people in the right jobs, to your point, to do the right testing, then actually the lines of defense were not a necessary part of that construct. What was the ability to create something which was undisputedly independent. Would you go that far, or do you think that's taking it too far?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of it is it's setting up objectives and incentives, and if those are aligned in terms of how things like compensation, promotion, things like that are all sort of set up in a non-conflicted way, I think that you could actually construct it many ways. I don't think it necessarily has to mean that you're in a different sort of organization necessarily, away from the front office.
So does that, at the risk of pushing you a bit too far, make the lines of defense redundant under those circumstances? Do we still need them, or can we just be really intelligent and build independent structures to meet those particular challenges where they're required?
I think it depends. I really think there's no general answer, but I think it depends on the risk itself, that what risk or that you're trying to mitigate. I think it depends on that. I think there's certain risks that you do need a little more independent segregation, and others where I think it's less important.
Very good. Shelley, I saw you smiling and nodding. Can I provoke you with that, or are you still laid back?
No, I think that it's I think Sean's answer is it depends is the right answer, because what we're talking about is a 3 lines of defense construct overlaid with an organizational structure in every organization, right? So you can still have 3 line. We global banks see this all the time. In your main hub, it's very easy to execute against 3 lines of defense. It's very much aligned with an organizational model. You can have a 1A taking the risk, a 1B managing the risk alongside the 1A, and you can have a second line overseeing and challenging, and third line auditing. When you go into regions where you have a smaller organization in the region, you can still execute against the 3 lines of defense construct, But the organizational structure is different because oftentimes you have people wearing many hats in smaller regions. So that's why I think the answer, it depends, is the right answer, because it's not as black and white as, you know, 3 lines of defense or just make sure it happens independently. I don't think it's that easy to execute or operationalize.
Maybe I just go back to a point that Joanna raised, which I thought was very important around obviously around the importance of really understanding and awareness of the risks and the risk identification process. And clearly that, you know, that's one of the topics that came up, you know, in our conversations, was the importance around a forward-looking view, you know, of the risks and horizon scanning. I think there was a general view that, you know, this was an area that, you know, firms still had more work to do around improving that capability. And there's a view that I think that the second line has an important role to play in that, you know, particularly because they often see risk events that are occurring, you know, across businesses, and they can bring that perspective to bear, as well as looking at what some of the, let's say, external industry risk events are. Just curious, it would be interesting your perspective on, you know, the role that the first line and the risk and control function plays, you know, within that arena of, you know, horizon scanning and forward-looking view of the risks, and how that partnership may work with the second line. Maybe Shelley, if you had a view first.
Yeah, I think there is, you know, we look at emerging risks, right? Everybody's got their emerging risk forum. There's some 8-box grid and things move, you know, top right, bottom left, depending on risk. I think those are the very high level horizon scanning, and we all have to do that. We've got to just be thoughtful about where businesses and jurisdictions and products we're going into and the impact of those broader risks on how we work. But I think that it's really important to leverage data and technology to focus on real versus perceived risk. So if you think, and that means we have to, again, go back to being very granular within the lines of business. And I think this is where the 1As and 1Bs and second line functions work very well together, or can work well together, to get very specific, because those emerging risk conversations are very, very high level. It's really when you get down to the business level and the region level that you can really have a forward-looking conversation. For example, we expanded into metals. We expanded into precious metals. What does that mean for people, process, systems, and our risk tolerance, our risk appetite, and the controls we have to have in place? We acquired, you know, a securitization business, as well as an electronic trading business in the last, you know, 18 months. What does that mean? You know, as we're doing our strategic planning every year and looking at the ROE targets, the net income targets, the efficiency targets, that's when we need to be having those conversations about, if we do that thing, what risk and people, process, and systems are impacted, and therefore what controls do we need to have in place. I think it's when you have that conversation strategically embedded in processes every year, that's when you're really going to have a more forward-looking view and be able to embed processes to capture and use data to learn from, as opposed to report what happened last quarter.
Joanna, any perspective on that?
No, I think it's very important to try and identify emerging risks but also with the lens of in the lens of things like risk appetite. I think there's certain risks that you certainly don't have an appetite for. You know, for example, no one wants to run the risk of any regulatory infraction, as an example. But then when it comes to things like operational incidents, you know, misbookings, things like that, history has shown that there is a run rate for these things, and oftentimes it's sort of it may or may not be detrimental to overall performance in a macro way. So there is sort of, I feel like there is a need to sort of frame everything in the context of what is your appetite for risks. I think the emerging horizon scanning thing is important. I do feel like the emphasis there has to be more balance. I think there should be probably more emphasis on that versus more the rearward looking stuff, and also policy adherence. I think there's a tendency to to focus more on, I guess, the theory of how you manage risk with self-assessments and all that kind of stuff, testing, versus what's coming around the corner. I think that there is a bit of a redistribution of time that would actually help manage the actual incident amounts better.
I think that's a really good observation. A lot of what my team does actually is working for the regulators, performing enforcement actions. So a perspective from that side, I would say probably one of the most common faults that leads to enforcement action can trace its roots to either the absence of or a poor quality business risk assessment. And in fact, in the case of one very large European organization, a complete lack of formalized risk appetite. From an organization you wouldn't necessarily expect to have that kind of thing missing from. So I think, although we're having a good conversation, and I think we are almost taking it as read, that the business risk assessment has been carefully done. We've looked at the instance of these risks, their potential impact, and the extent to which we can control them, and what the resultant risks might be. My experience is actually that even in surprisingly large and what I'll call sophisticated organizations, the risk assessments are often of extremely poor quality. And there is perhaps, if anything, a focus on the risks which the organization knows it can control, and a tendency to sweep under the carpet those risks where, either for systems reasons or other, it's difficult to gather the data necessary to demonstrate that you're controlling or measuring the risk concerned. Obviously, you guys wouldn't fall into that particular trap, but I'm wondering whether in your more general industry experience, you've seen those kind of issues as well.
With the risk assessments not being
Yes.
so robust?
Should I say the quality of them? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, they're subjective, and they're not based on data, right? I mean, we are changing the way we're doing it at our firm to using a lot more data, focus on process controls, and it's, I got to tell you, some of the other operating groups, like I talked about the maturity level, they're not where our business is, and it's very painful. But I think it's the right way to go. I think, why do work if it's not going to add value and make you safer?
Absolutely.
Just on the, I have a question also to the panel, just to follow up on it's in the same theme of risk assessments and understanding the levels of risk that businesses are running in the horizon scanning elements. Are you bringing the third line of defense into those discussions as well, like the audit function? And how do you see the audit function, in operating, going forward in the three lines of defense? Maybe one provocative question would be, if you were in the middle of a management meeting between the second line and the third line, what would be the advice that you would give them to go forward? But it's a lot of the question, but maybe just bringing in the third line, how do you bring them into the risks assessments?
And the risk assessment, I don't think they are involved in the risk assessment. The way we work most closely with I'm not sure it would be value added to have them in the risk assessment. Everybody can't be in every meeting. I think you've got to have the people who understand the risk and are closest to it, making judgments. But we work very closely with our audit partners as we're designing, right? We work very closely with our audit partners as we're changing. We work closely with our audit partners as we're remediating. And the value that we see from our audit partners is truly a distanced, independent view based on that audit lens. And we find it very helpful. We do a lot of beating up of ideas. We use zero-based design, which you might be familiar with, where you basically said, if it's your own company and you were to do this change or this remediation or this process, how would you do it? Would it be half as expensive and use one person and be totally automated? Yes, probably. And so as we're using zero-based design, we're really pushing where we want to go, but we want audit's view, just as we want our compliance partners and our operational risk partners view. So we use them a little bit differently. I'm not sure there's a lot of value add in the risk assessment process.
Yeah, I think some thinking would be that the more they understand, and your point's so well taken, that you want them to keep that sort of bird's eye view on things and sort of make sure that things are, logic, and, whereas we as practitioners are sometimes very deep into the specifics, right, and sort of can lose that perspective. At the same time, for audit functions to be effective, they also need to understand the emerging risks. As even Schwan said, they can't be risk experts in all of the different areas. I mean, maybe Schwan, from the BNY Mellon market side, how are you guys engaging the third line of defense in helping manage risk and develop controls?
Yeah, and look, I think they are similar to how Shelley articulated. We engage them, but then audit is really the independent line. They have separate reporting to the board in most places, so they can't be too conflicted in that respect. In my mind, that it's not the audit group so much which is causing the issue. I think that there's more the duplication is more in the second, because you do want some sort of level of independent assurance, which is what I think an audit function provides. It's where you have the quasi audit functions crop up in the second line that I feel creates more of a duplicated sort of process. So I'm not so concerned with the auditors per se, but it's important obviously just for them to understand the strategy and where we're going, so that when they come around and look, they see things with the same lens. I think that's a perennial discussion in any firm. You're never going to get the same level of commonality, and there's always going to have to be time invested in the education and awareness.
Maybe I'll just ask one question. We've had a question just submitted into the chat room, and basically asking if you've seen or provide examples of where you've seen a real effective partnership with the second line, who has come to the table really as a trusted partner, independent, but also providing advice and constructive feedback to assist with helping the first line with the awareness, including maybe some of the strategic thinking around the business and the risk appetite statement. So it would be helpful to see if maybe you have some examples to share where you've seen this working well between the lines. And Shelley, it sounds like you've managed to develop a strong working relationship between the lines. So maybe if there are some examples you could provide, that would be helpful to people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've done so much in the way of technology, enhancements, whether it's in spoofing or swap adjudication or digitizing voice, our predictive capability, as I said, to prevent operational losses. And in all of those conversations, we have our partners at the table. If you think about digitizing voice, for example, the question is, why do we still have people listening to phone calls? Even if the voice is recorded and archived somewhere, why is it that people still have to listen to phone calls? And when there's technology out there to digitize that, use machine learning to adjudicate, and then let people know when there's a real problem so people can use their brains and judgment, right? So in that process, we talk about, what are the compliance, and algo risk is another place we do this. What are the compliance requirements? What's the difference between jurisdictions? And we get advice from our compliance partners there. What is the difference in how we manage voice or algo risk in North America versus Europe versus Asia? And then we bring in our operational risk partners, and they will have a different lens from the second line. We'll handle the processes and controls from the first line. What we then will talk to the second line about is, well, what does this mean for operational risk capital? What does it mean for, our risk assessment, as we said? And you just keep going around those different spokes on the risk and compliance areas and bring them in. But like I said, every change that we're making, we're relying, and especially during COVID, right? I mean, what is the new way of working anyways? As we start looking forward, and what are we going to be allowed to do? And is that going to be different by regulator in national level jurisdiction, but what about the states and provinces? There's an extraordinary amount of work that we're partnering with our second line partners with in the design of the future state. So I can go on and on and on, which I won't, but lots of different examples.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah.
great. I think we just have a few minutes left, in the session. So I wanted to just maybe throw it out there if maybe Nigel, if you wanted to make any final comments, we can go to Shelley and then Sean, and then Mark and I will just wrap it up. So Nigel, any final comments from you?
I think the one thing that we have not touched on so far in this session that was touched on somewhat in the European and APAC session was the question of trust. Why is it that there is this need, apparently in some second lines, to effectively replicate tests that are already being carried out by the first line? Why is it that the first line isn't confident that the second line can do a good job for them in terms of monitoring and surveillance? And it comes down to trust. Most often in the sessions that we held, there was kind of, well, we don't really trust them. Second line doesn't trust the first line to do the right thing, which I guess is their job. And the first line doesn't trust the second line to be competent, to actually understand the business and therefore to offer the right advice. And so trust was blamed, shall we say, or at least cited as being the reason for a lot of the kind of slightly deficient behaviors that we've touched on this afternoon. So I guess by way of a real quick closing question, I appreciate it's a big subject. How much do we think trust is actually an issue here? And is there anything we can do to deal with that angle?
Shall I jump in? Though I think we don't have much time left. I think it comes down to transparency, and my final comment was going to be around the way we work, not about what we do, but how we do it. We use objectives and key results that we create during our strategic planning. We socialize those with each of our second line partners and our lines of business. We agree on the objective, the key result, who's doing what when, and then we're in execution mode throughout the year. The other thing that I think we need transparency on is talent. So we have a skills matrix that says the skills, knowledge, and talent that we need for every corporate title level on my team, for each team within my team. And I share that with our second line partners. And I said, this is what a VP does on my team in compliance. This is what a associate does in this operational risk team. And that's my expectation for my team. What's your expectation for your team? And it prompts a dialogue around what's required from a talent perspective, and that needs to be ever changing. So I think transparency, shared planning, and a common agreement on talent is very important.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, I think, for me, a lot of it, this whole topic I'm very curious to find out the output of the regulatory discussions as well, when it comes down to mandate, because I feel like that will then reinforce sort of how people should really be operating in the most optimal way. I think trust is somewhat related to competency, to sort of what Shelley was talking about. Get the right people in the right seats, then it should work. But I think that we tend to hide behind lines of defense in some respects to obscure competency in some cases, and we have to get the right people in the right seats. Going back to that, there was a comment on that zero-based approach. I think that's a right way of looking at it. If you were running this as your own way, you wouldn't need to have so many lines of defense, because you just want to pay one person to do the right job the first time. And it's sort of this, it feels like organizations have been sort of set up against one another internally, which creates a lot of inefficiency.
Absolutely. Thank you. Very good.
Mark, any final comments from your side?
No, I think for the time. So thank you for all participants. It's been a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, I want to thank again Shelley and Sean for their great participation and input. Colleagues like yourselves are really making a difference in the market, and people are watching, and so I think the regulators are watching. So I think we're at the beginning of a pretty interesting paradigm. So really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.
And that concludes our session.